everyone. Thank you to our June Partner Seminar. We're just delighted to see you. My name is Holly Manasiri. I'm a faculty member and a outreach coordinator here at the Center on Disability Studies, and it's really my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Susan Rocco will be here sharing information on SPIN, everything SPIN. And as you could see in our flyer, the Special Parent Information Network, or SPIN, is a project of the Disability and Communication Access Board and the Department of Education. Its purpose is to enhance the participation of parents with children with disabilities in the decision-making process involving their child's education. SPIN promotes parent involvement in the education of their child with special needs through information about special education process, due process options, and parent professional partnerships. And Susan found her calling as a systems advocate for children with disabilities and their families after her son Jason experienced significant disabilities resulting from surgery as an infant. She became a parent volunteer in early 1985 on the pilot offering for information referrals and parent-to-parent support to families here in Hawaii for children who were eligible for early intervention and special education services. And she has continued to serve as SPIN's coordinator ever since, and the rest is history, as they say. And I'm just delighted. And Susan, thank you so much for making time, and I'll just turn this over to you.
Well, I love getting to talk with folks, and I'm very laid back. If I look formal, it's a big mirage, because I will tell you anything. So as Daintree knows. So let me start with our name, which is kind of a goofy name. We're talking decades ago, 3.5 decades ago, that we got SPIN started. And at the time, there was a sense that parents who had kids with disabilities were somehow exceptional. Remember, we had a magazine called Exceptional Parent that we all looked at for years. And I guess they were looking for an acronym that would allow a good logo. Our original logo was a spinning top, but we later upgraded to a spinning globe so that we could say we offered a world of support. And SPIN in the early days was confused with SPAN, which was the Single Parent Advocacy Network. And I was single at the time, so it really confused callers, but it has all worked out. And as you know, once you have a name and an acronym, you can never change it because it takes so long for people to know you exist. You don't want to blow that. So again, I don't want to give you too much information, but I want to give you a history of SPIN very briefly, and also let you know what our main activities are and what we're up to and how we might be able to interface with your organization or your family. That's what we're here for. So I mentioned that we go way back to 1984, and SPIN was basically the idea of 3 headstrong mamas, one of whom has epic fame in Hawaii. Her name is Iva-Lee Sinclair, and I know Daintree and many others bow down to her legacy. She's an amazing woman who's now 92 or 93. But she and the other 2 mamas went to the Department of Education and said, hey, you know, we've got kids with really significant needs, and everywhere we go to get information, we get misinformation, or we get referred back to the agency that just told us to call you. So we would really like for you to fund a parent-to-parent organization, because at that point it was well known that having other families supporting you was going to be a positive thing. We were going to have more positive spin on things. We were going to be optimistic. And if you met a parent that was a little older than you that looked like they were put together, it was a sense of great hope that you might survive the immediate crisis. So we started SPIN as a pilot within the Disability and Communication Access Board. And we were able to get the Department of Education to write a memorandum of agreement for that program. And it's unique in the nation in the sense that there are a lot of programs called Parent Training and Information Programs, PTIs. The LDAH is the one that has the Hawaii contract with the Office of Special Education Programs. But SPIN was a little different because it was within a state agency. And the idea was that DCAB was a state clearinghouse for all disability types. It wasn't more specific like Daintree's DD Council. It covered the whole gamut of disability and legislation and resources. And by putting SPIN in this neutral zone, families would feel safe about calling and spilling their guts about what was really bothering them, often what was bothering them about the special education system. And remarkably, we have been allowed to stay there at DCAB for 37 years. We've had a couple of dust-ups with folks in DOE, but luckily they weren't at the very top, so we were saved. And the memorandum of agreement that we have basically calls for us to do about 5 things, and we're going to get into that pretty soon. But you can see one of those things we no longer do, and that was when I first got hired in July of '85, I was told I had to do a radio show, and that just freaked me out. And I think the only consistent listener we had was my mother, but it taught me a lot about agencies because I would have to find somebody to interview. And it was a really great learning experience for me. But then we dumped the idea of a radio show and we picked up the idea of an annual parent conference. And we knew from the very beginning that we needed to involve all of our parent agency partners because we didn't want to be in competition. We wanted to be helping each other inform families and give them a sense of support. So that's when we had our first conference in 1987. And for those of you that are savvy about the disability world, we had Rudd and Ann Turnbull, who were superstars at the time. They were at the University of Kansas. They were parents of a young man with autism, Jay, and they were our keynotes. And so I thought, well, this has to be a success, and it was. We later in our contract also received responsibility of supporting SEAC. Now, I can't see everybody, but do you all know what SEAC is? SEAC stands for the Special Education Advisory Council, and it is a mandated body under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it basically is a nonpartisan group that helps advise the Department of Education in every state about the unmet needs of kids with disabilities. And there is a requirement that every state advisory panel, and we call ours SEAC, it must be made up of a majority of either parents of kids under the age of 27 or individuals with disabilities. And that's so that it's not a rubber stamp of whatever the state level folks want to do. And so SPIN was given the responsibility to be the logistical support for SEAC because it was kind of humbug for the Special Education Administration to have to arrange for flights and pay for per diem, et cetera, et cetera. So we took that on, and it involves very tedious minute taking. If you ever need something to read before bedtime, just go to our SEAC website and read some minutes, and it'll put you out really fast. But the idea behind those tedious minutes is we're basically documenting our conversations every month. And it's a good way to see how systems advocacy is working. And then finally, we moved into the 21st century and joined social media. Now, I am truly a dinosaur. I don't go on Facebook except once a month when I think about it. But I have a much younger partner in the form of Amanda Ka'ahanui. And she's a great social media person. So we've gotten Facebook pretty down pat, but we're not into Instagram or tweeting. But we have moved somewhat into the future, which is a good thing. I have, let's see, I'm going to move that over. And then finally, we wanted to talk about what we all experienced, and that was losing the continuity of getting together with each other because of the pandemic. And we were forced to have a virtual conference. But we found that the silver lining in that was that we now archived all of our presentations. And I see Ronald is on the call, and he and Daintree both have been speakers in our conferences, and you can go to our Spin Conference website and check them out. They were wonderful. So I gave you the history of why we were at DCAD. And the other thing that we want you to know is that we're considered a federal project just because the Department of Education uses a portion of those IDEA funds that it receives and uses it on SPIN. So we're federally funded. And that means that we have to pay for our own French benefits. So even though SPIN is a two-person office within this bigger office of DCAD, when we add our fringes, they're about 60% of salaries. So our $200,000 a year project is mainly salaries and fringe. We're not big spenders. We beg money off our partners, don't we, Daintree? So we were talking about what our values are, and I'm sure they're the same ones that you share. It is interesting, though, that if you have a parent organization, they sometimes have a slightly different focus than a self-advocacy organization or a professional organization, because we're looking at it from the parents' point of view, their sense of responsibility, the things that they're needing to do. And so we have always been a resource for families first and helping professionals second. But we believe in giving everybody as much information as possible because that's how our families get served. So of course, information is power unless it makes you anxious, and then you don't call SPIN. So I think, like most agencies, we are just getting the tip of the iceberg of families who are really worried or concerned or searching, and they have the time to call, they have the wherewithal to call. So many families are struggling, but they don't have time, they don't have resources, they're not sure what questions to ask. So we're always in a search for how we can do better outreach to those families. We have fought long and hard for family school partnerships, and we'll go into that a little bit later in the presentation. And also, we are very early signers on to inclusive education, and that goes with community inclusion. My own dear boy, Jason, was the first kid with a significant disability to be included in a general ed classroom in about 1991. It was at Pearl Ridge Elementary. And he went from a 5-kid classroom that was loosely referred to as a K to 6 classroom, which is crazy. How can you be K to 6? To this orderly, lovely classroom at Pearl Ridge. And I thought, my God, they're going to throw him out in the first week because he wanders and he makes noises and he's not a talker and he's not a reader and he's got all these eccentricities. And much to my surprise, it was wonderful. It was beautiful. And much of the success was due to the kids themselves. And that's because 5th graders have a social conscience. And they were intrigued by Jason and they wanted to take credit for everything he ever did. So we let him take that credit. And we had a beautiful experience for 2 years and then had to slip into middle school and then get dragged into high school, becoming more and more secluded every year. But it's still a value that we strongly believe in, and we think it should go down to kindergarten, pre-kindergarten, the babysitters, whatever, so that kids grow up together and they can see each other's gifts and appreciate them and work around them. Self-determination is something that we talk about more for adults. And I'm always careful not to say that we're striving for independence, because sometimes for people like Jason, that's really putting him in a box and separating him from others. I'm the first to say I'm not independent, I'm interdependent. I count on so many people to get where I need to go. And I believe all people, unless they live in a cave or somehow they're chanting all day long, are independent, interdependent, I mean. And so self-determination is great because it means people have choice and control in their lives, but we don't want to push them into getting off the couch 8 o'clock at night to have a teaching moment, because that's not kind to them. That's not what we would demand of ourselves. I think I covered all of this, so we're going to move on. So we mentioned our contract, and there are just 2 of us, but we have a fabulous group of advisors. And so we can put our fingers in a lot of different pies. We have a phone line, and we cutely call it a warm line, because we certainly don't want to be a hotline. That would really be scary to be that responsible. And we don't have crisis services, but we are an information line that's available whenever it's a weekday and it's not a state holiday. And it's interesting that over the pandemic, we're getting more and more emails over phone calls. I think that's the way the world is moving. So our newsletter is funny because in the very early days, we would paste it up basically like the old newspaper rooms did. And then we would make sure that we printed as many copies as there were kids in special education. So in the early days of SPIN, we were printing out 17,000 copies of this newsletter. And then we were dropping off at schools. And the good thing about it was we had a lot more name recognition in those days. The bad thing was that a lot of them ended up in the trash can at school and didn't make it home to mama or dad. And then a lot of families said, what's this? We don't need this. And they'd use it for the bird cage. But nowadays, because primarily of funding cuts, we moved away from physically printing the newsletter and only sending it out electronically. But we know that not every parent has access to a printer, to the internet even. So we are willing and able to print copies should a family need them. We mentioned our Facebook page. That's primarily manned by Amanda, who pays attention, but I will go on there occasionally. And we have what's called an e-blast, which is another way to get information out. And that means you have identified yourself as someone who wants to know when an agency or an event is offering something new. And SPIN, of all of the parent serving agencies, probably has a slightly larger emphasis on sharing information from other sources. We try to make sure that people understand it's not SPIN sponsoring something, but it's a place where folks might go to look. And that's tricky because so many good resources out there, but parents don't know they're there. So we try to use the e-blast system, the newsletter, and our conference, whatever we have, to let families know about resources that might be helpful to them. I mentioned the SPIN conference and our archived videos, and some of them are excellent. If you ever want to just go browse some folks have used them for training purposes for their own agencies, because SPIN believes that the information should be delivered by a team, typically, consisting of either a parent or a person with a disability and a helping professional, because people in the audience benefit from both points of view, and some will learn from one side and some will learn from the other. But we are spotlighting the fact that both are valued sources of information. So we've kept that up over the years. And then on our website, we have another old project that we've kept going all these years. It's called A Parent's Guide to Partnership in Special Education. And we got into that really early on, in the mid 80s, as a way of demystifying the chapter 60. At the time it was chapter 36, the document about administrative rules for special education that's written very formally and somewhat legally. So we would take that information and we would parse it into little points, always with the idea of partnering. And then we put it in a flip chart so that families could go to whatever thing they were interested in. And so we're still printing that after 30 something years, and you'll get to run across one of these days. The virtual version is on our website. So there's our Facebook followers. They're steadily growing. We're not a rock star site, but it was so interesting. Holly, I don't think it was CDS. I think it was the SPED department had decided to do some tutoring this summer in reading, and it was partnering with DOE about it. And we spread the word on that. We had 13,000 hits on this one post. Wow. So sometimes the wind takes it and moves it on, because that was a free service that everybody wanted. Sadly, they could only, I think they took 20 kids or something, but there was great demand for that. So here's the conference, which is so much fun. We figure it has to be different from other conferences. I love PAC-RIM, but it can get pretty funky, but not as funky as SPIN, because we want to take the young family who's coming into a big group of people for the first time and make them feel comfortable. And one of the ways we do that is by having the advisory committee do a musical number as an opener. And we all look like asses, basically. But it gets people to the point where they feel comfortable approaching us. And we make a theme. I love this one with Christina to put her chef's hat down over her head. But each year is a theme. That was SPIN's Recipe for Success. And this was SPIN Goes Hollywood. And this was 2001, A SPIN Odyssey. We just have fun with it. And we are going to be having a conference October 22nd. I was talking to Holly earlier. We pray that we're going to be at the campus center at UH, because that's the ideal venue for us. But we're waiting to see if they have enough staff to accommodate us. But what it is basically is a series of workshops throughout the day. And then we all get together for lunch. And a nice part of the luncheon time frame is that we honor people. We have parents that we honor. We have professionals that we honor, and kind of model them to the rest of the audience, saying, here's what really impresses parents. Maybe you want to try to emulate this person. And often that person is not celebrated in another way. It's wonderful if we can find somebody who's not been kissed on the feet and really raise them up for adoration, because they deserve it. So I mentioned SEAC earlier, which is the Special Education Advisory Council. And for me personally, it's been a wonderful ride because within SPIN, which is part of the Disability and the Communication Access Board, we really can't be political in any way. We can't go to the legislature and lobby for anything, but SEAC can. And through the leadership of Iva Lee, who was our chair for years, we got into the habit of going to the legislature and then a little bit later to the Board of Education and really trying to embody the wishes of families of kids with disabilities who were either in special education or likely to be eligible for special education, and give legislators and policymakers a sense of what would be helpful to these families. And in our annual report to the superintendent, we began to put together these infographics that were statistics about how SPED kids were doing. And I don't know about you, but it's hard to find those statistics sometimes. Briefly, when DOE embraced a strategic plan, they developed a dynamic report where you could go and compare kids with disabilities on a number of indicators like absenteeism and academic performance, et cetera. But that was kind of late coming, and it didn't always have real specific information. So we use our little insert to the annual report to flesh those out again. If there's something to celebrate, we'll do it. But primarily, we're showing how far behind kids with disabilities are to their non-disabled peers. And one thing that masks that huge gap is that so often their performance is compared to all students. Well, all students includes more than a majority of kids with high needs. It includes kids with disabilities, kids who are English learners, and kids who are economically disadvantaged. So if you really want to see what the difference is, you compare kids without any high needs and kids with high needs. And of that group, SPED is always at the very bottom. It doesn't matter what the indicator is. If it's the only time English learners come close and sometimes even up is with English language arts, to be expected. And yet EL kids do so well once they exit that program. They are really great performers, sometimes outperforming their peers. So we want to keep putting a spotlight on it. And we don't think we're crying wolf because we look at the mainland. We look for sources of comparison. And we see that on the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the only assessment that's done in every state across the nation, Hawaii is always at the very bottom, within 3 places of being dead last in reading and math. And so that's not just a quirk of being out in the Pacific, that's an issue of the kids not really getting their needs met. Because demographically, there are kids who are in need everywhere. But why is Hawaii so behind on certain indicators? And we try to call this out so that eventually people will start paying attention. And a good example of us, spitting in the wind for years and finally hitting a good spot was when we influenced Brian DeLima, a former board member who sadly has since passed away. But we finally got his attention about SPED achievement and performance. And he was able to get the Board of Education to put much more of an emphasis on helping vulnerable kids first, and then the rest of the kids. And that kind of was shepherded in by the Kishimoto administration, but it's still an emphasis of the board. And that's how we were able to finally get kids with disabilities in general ed classrooms with supports. We call it inclusion. But at the time that we were yelling about how poorly we were doing, only 36% of our kids were in a general ed classroom for the majority of the school day. Nowadays, it is 54%, but the national average is 66%. And there are states that have 100% of kids in general ed classrooms for the majority of the day. So we've got a hurdle to go through, and it's maddeningly slow progress. But we all know that if a kid is placed in a general ed classroom and given the right support, he's likely to do better academically and socially and behaviorally. So, I mean, there are exceptions. There are deaf kids who need an environment where folks are signing to them, and that's not the general ed environment. But for most kids, it works. Even for my kiddo, Jason, who was considered to be severely intellectually disabled. And as I speak of the dear boy, he's wandering in. Can you say hello, babe? He's searching for my soda. Yeah, oh well. There goes my soda. He's asking for me to take his shoes off. This boy is a prince, I tell you. Okay. All righty. Even for kids like Jason, he benefited from being in a general ed environment. It really improved his behavior, but mostly it changed the mind of all of his classmates, so that when they see him on the street, he's a friend, he's a colleague, he's somebody they would help in a pinch. Honey, you go that way, you go get your candy. All right. Eric's trying to lure him with some nerds. We'll see if it works. Anyway, that's where the infographic comes in. And then the other really neat thing SEAC's been doing for the last 3 or 4 years are infographics. I know we're not unique in that, but we, are you okay with that? Yeah. We learned that that's a much better way to communicate information to a broad group of people. And our target often is parents. So for instance, this one infographic grew out of our state systemic improvement plan, which is part of the state performance plan, an annual performance report that OSEP collects every year from each state. And the state systemic improvement plan in Hawaii concentrated on reading and early literacy. And we were trying to find a way to get families to be involved by just targeting a few items for them about spending so many minutes a day, if possible, letting their child read to them and not just the other way around, turning on closed captioning on the television set. But something like that infographic is a conversation starter also. It's not just a handout that you let go, but it's a way to generate more information and hopefully more solutions to what the problems are, more buy-in to it. Don't. Is anybody snoring? No, I can't tell. Okay, so to get into the weeds with SEAC, and by the way, these are monthly meetings. You'll see in a minute our website. Anybody can come and join the meeting, and it's quite interesting because we might have the budget assistant superintendent or whatever. You find out things that you might not get some other way. But what we do at the beginning of every school year is we find out what DOE's focus is, because we don't want to be working at cross purposes. But then we also have our members vote on their priorities. And we try to limit it to about 3 or 4 what we call buckets. so that we have time in our 10-month schedule to really spend some time on each topic and try to move it forward. The whole idea behind SEAC is that we're using the practice of leading by convening, which is a process developed by the IDEA partnership. I'm sure it comes by other names and other groups, but the idea is that you are using a diverse group of stakeholders. You're bestowing on each of them the same level of respect and expectation, and you're making sure you have the right people around a particular problem, and then you do the work together, and then you learn from that and you move up. You continually try to spiral up in solving these complex problems. So the buckets that we picked for this past year were extended school year, and some of you know this has been an issue for a long time. Not all kids get ESY, services beyond the school day. But those that were getting it were sometimes getting it for the wrong reason, or many kids were denied ESY when really they could rightfully meet the criteria set by IDEA. So that was a priority. We now have an infographic about it that you can look at. We were also really into COVID policies. We've been disappointed as a body that since the beginning of the pandemic, that promise made by OSEP early on about, well, we're going to make up services to kids, don't you worry. If anybody loses ground because of the pandemic, we'll find a way to help them catch up. Well, I'm not sure that's really happened for any kid, but especially not for SPED kids, because we've had so very little utilization of an option called a COVID Impact Services Plan. And that means services provided beyond the school day that are short-term and intense to help the kiddo catch up. And out of 20,000 SPED kids and 5,000 504 kids, we've only had about 500 plans put together in the last 2 years. And that just doesn't seem to be hitting the mark, but I'm not sure. Secondary transition has been a focus, and that's because the Department of Education recently came out with new transition guidelines. And then the last big priority we had was participating in that process of looking at all the indicators that OSEP looks at and putting our 2 cents in and trying to work on solutions and improvement activities. So here are those websites I talked about. We manage 3. SpinHawaii.org is the original. And sometimes we forget to update it. So if you see something really old, please tell us. The second one is where we decided to place our conference videos and to sell it, to advertise what's coming up at the SPIN conference. And then the third website is the one that we keep for SEAC. And it has minutes, it has annual reports, you can see who members are, et cetera, et cetera. So the other big thing that we do, Amanda and I, is to publish a quarterly newsletter. And in the old days, I mentioned that we would print out those 17,000 copies. Now they're all digital. And we've really moved into infographics. You can tell in this is called a special edition because it only has 4 pages, where we focus on a topic rather than a variety. We are celebrating the fact that, and this is coming up in our conference, that if parents learned some basic skills early on in their journey with their child, it would serve them through the whole journey. And that's what we call marathon skills. It's not a sprint. So I just wanted to give you a short history of some of the things we've done to promote partnership. And this was one of our early efforts. You all know that IDEA was reauthorized last in 2004, but it actually was not, it didn't affect our local rules, regulations until 2009. That's when Chapter 60 was put together. Prior to that, it was called Chapter 56, but because it had a lot of changes, they wanted to upgrade the number so as not to confuse folks. And the original message we got with IDEA 2004 was, gosh, it's too bad those Republicans were in control of Congress, because they took away things that you had in the last iteration of IDEA. But too bad, it's just politics. And we didn't accept that. IDEA 97 had some really wonderful things in it that we didn't want to lose. And so Iva Lee and her grandeur got representation from all of the parent-serving organizations, including SEAC and SPIN. And we went to Superintendent Hamamoto and talked her into having this community work group that would come up with revisions to IDEA 2004 that actually went beyond the regulations. And that's also when we were able to change some of those deadly eligibility labels, like seriously emotionally disturbed, which is awful, and mentally retarded. We changed that before Rosa's law changed it. We took away the word impairment because that's not cool, and everything became a disability. But this group, amazingly, was able to make some big changes, and that was a positive thing. And we're moving on here. Another thing we did had to do with suggesting that treating family partnerships like you would design a classroom or universal design was a smart idea. If you really wanted families to participate, you would give them information in a variety of methods, not just one, not just tell them to come to a workshop at school, and if they didn't, decide that they were apathetic, but do a lot of things to engage the family. Then also provide them with a number of ways to communicate with you or to participate. Maybe they're just participating in a survey, or maybe they are a school leader, or maybe they're serving on the state or in the school community council, et cetera, et cetera. And the big thing that we've said for years, and it's rarely noted, is that whenever you do a training, you should involve parents as co-trainers, because they know what it feels like to be on the receiving end. Students too. And finally, on the affective side, do something to motivate the parents to participate. Don't just call them names when they don't. So that was something we offered up. I don't know whether it has been used much, but here's another way of putting that forward. Then the other biggie that we did was, and it was with Brian DeLima's help on the board, is to get them to change their parent involvement strategy to a family and community engagement partnership policy. And it embraced all of the principles that had already been put together by the National PTA, which are great. And my favorite one, as you can imagine, as this helicopter goes overhead, is bullet number 5, which is sharing power. That was a big one. And then because we were lucky enough to come into some new partners at the state level in DOE, we were engaged at the beginning of the pandemic to turn a lot of their directives into infographics for families, because they sure look dry in a memo, but you could understand what a contingency plan was about in an infographic, or how to prepare for a virtual IEP in an infographic. So that's where that came in. And then a joy that Amanda and I have is that we get to sit on a variety of boards and councils and task forces. And it's really a privilege. As a parent, you can say, well, I need to go everywhere because my kid gets health care and my oldest son's going to college and my infant is moving up to kindergarten or whatever. So you put your finger in a lot of different pies. In the beginning years of SPIN, we were the token parent representative on a committee, but it really is a privilege and a pleasure to be part of a lot of different groups because you learn so much. You really understand systems better. And one thing that we believe strongly in is that we're all trying to do good, but we have different paradigms that we filter information through. And when you have a chance to serve in a group where there's a variety of stakeholders, you begin to break down some of those barriers and perceptions you have about where the other person's coming from. You learn to accommodate that difference and not to bemoan it, basically. So that is it. I think I've talked your ear off.
So wonderful, and just a wealth of information. Thank you so much, Susan. In the chat, there were just a few things. We were kind of going back and forth around all of the information that you were sharing about the e-blast and social media and the Facebook group. And we're just curious about, like, what's the best way if, our faculty and staff here at CDS want to be sharing information, what's the best way for them to get that kind of information to you so that they can make sure that some of the project activities they're working on that can really benefit children with disabilities and families of children with disabilities gets to them?
Well, I think in most of our publications, we say to either call or email us, and the generic email is spin@doh.hawaii.gov. I will tell you that we have a bias towards mining parents' information and expertise without compensation. We believe there's been so many graduate students over the years that say, oh, I've got this project and I need to ask parents of kids with autism about X, and I only need about an hour of their time. Could you direct me to these parents? And we say, no, we can't really do that, but you can offer an incentive. And then if that parent chooses to spend their time helping you, that's their choice. It's just it's an acknowledgement that I know personally I have less time than some of my neighbors. And I want to be able to feel that I'm using it usefully. And often parents will do it if they think there's an outcome, but a term paper is not it generally. So, even a graduate level.
Great. Thank you for that. And there's another comment in the chat here. This is from Sandra. Susan, thank you for all that you've done. Is there a SPIN-like agency in any other state for young adults, older adults? Our young adult support group is no longer on the SPIN resource list as far as I could see. Perhaps we aged out. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, so you're right, Sandy, in that our focus is on families, and it's generally on families of parents who are IDEA eligible, and that goes from 0 to 22. And yet I'm a parent of an older guy. I understand the Medicaid system and the DD division. So we can offer you as mama our perspective, but for the individuals to get the support they need, Daintree's self-advocacy network is really excellent. There are also organizations for different disability categories. I mean, the Autism Society or TACA being one group that often will put together groups for adults, because it's a different ballgame altogether. And there are self-advocacy organizations. I would go on Google to look for most of them, or I'd go through the DD councils if you're talking about folks that might have a developmental disability, because they really are big on self-advocacy as well. And the wonderful thing about self-advocacy is they put us in our place all the time. I don't want that, I want this, kind of a thing. And we really try to listen when they speak. So.
Susan, now maybe something comparable, but not just like SPIN, but I know like Family Voices, I know with Josie Wall and Leolinda Parlin, that's a resource that I think is national, correct?
That's right. And Family Voices started during the Clinton administration. Remember when Hillary was going to fix health care? The families across the country said, wait a minute, you're not inviting us to the table, and we have medically fragile kids. So that's when Family Voices got going. And there was a wonderful administrator in the maternal and child health at the federal level that really enabled Josie and Polly Arango and Julie Beckett, whose daughter was responsible for the Medicaid waiver, basically, to start Family Voices and have chapters everywhere. You can often find those folks if you go to a website called Parent Hub. And what they're doing is acknowledging all the federally funded projects in each state. Parent Center Hub. I don't know whether it's .org, but you can't miss it if you type in that word. And then we've got, here in Hawaii, we've got Hilo Pa'a as well. They have a slightly different, our original focus was on education. Hilo Pa'a is funded through maternal and child health monies primarily, and their focus is on healthcare and on insurance. So they're much more knowledgeable about that, and we refer families to them if that's the issue. And of course, there are advocacy organizations, there's disability-specific organizations. We try to keep track.
Just a wealth of resources here that we're sharing. And everyone, thank you so much. We're all still putting resources here in the chat. Yeah, thank you. Ronald, I know you said that you're leaving. Yes, and he has a comment. Thanks for organizing the session. It's great learning more about the SPIN after years of going to the conferences. Yes, absolutely.
You didn't ask any juicy questions, though, I'm sure.
Thank you, Susan. This was really great. I really appreciate knowing the whole history and your passion and your involvement. It really makes it much more meaningful, right? And why we do what we do. And your interdependence is especially true, I mean, like in this region of where we live. So it's great to hear, from you that about the interdependence, and human beings are social beings, right? We cannot live alone. So yeah. So it's great to hear about your own vision for how you are running this.
I've been so lucky. I mean, I'm guided by you advisors, Kariko, but it's been a dream job for me because I'm selfishly, plucking this fact and that fact, and I'm working on this relationship. It's all selfishly directed towards making the world a better place for Jason. I always introduced myself as Jason's mom forever, and then people would get confused after he got past 30. So he's 41 now. I should know for sure. Yeah, he's 41.
No, it's always nice to have Jason. Like Jason is the real person, right? So I always said, I appreciate that there's always a little bit of Jason in your background, or when you are talking, because yeah, that makes him all much more meaningful.
Mama know how that works.
Well, Susan, thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording here and you can see like folks still want to stay on and share with you. We can hang out here for a minute, but we're really grateful for your time, your dedication, sharing all these great resources with us today. So thank you.
Well, thank you all.